Perhaps they make Charlie your father, but you can't do that, can you? I am not saying he's a great man. Willie Loman never earned a lot of money. His name was never in the paper. He's not the finest character that ever lived. But he's a human being. And a terrible thing is happening to him. So attention must be paid. He must not be allowed to fall into his grave like an old dog. Attention. Attention must finally be paid to such a person. You called him crazy?
Mom, I didn't...
Wait a minute. A lot of people think he's lost his balance, but you don't have to be very smart to know what his trouble is. The man is exhausted.
Sure.
A small man can be just as exhausted as a great man.
Charlie and Bernard, Willie himself, Biff. Amanda nominates Charlie and Bernard, who make great choral characters. Towards the end, Willie tells Charlie, "You're the only friend I got." Right after Charlie tells him nobody's worth nothing, Dad. Considering Willie commits suicide, this leads to a huge tragic irony that plays a role, with Charlie playing a choral character. Well, if Amanda, "you're this," refers to Charlie's telling Willie something that leads to his death, okay, then indeed we would have Miller refashioning the chorus into a body that could act effectually in the play's world without abandoning its position as mere commentators on the action who stand apart from it. Nothing they do, but merely their commentary, according to this reading of the play, kills Willie. It would be as if Sophocles had endowed his chorus with the power Tiresias wields, the power to change Creon's mind. But many will doubt that Charlie plays much of a role in Willie's demise, especially in contrast to Ben or Biff. Charlie does not truly act, does he? He gets nothing done. He can't even persuade Willie to take money. He makes a donation at one point. Indeed, he stands apart. Recall, the modern chorus is, quote, a person within the play itself who stands apart from the action, and by his or her comments provides the audience with a special perspective through which to view the other characters and events. See, according to this definition, if Charlie is choral, he is such in the traditional or classical, perennial, and not in some radical new sense. I'll have something to say down below about a radical new innovation in the way that you treat the choral, and how that is conceivably something people might be doing in the present, if not 100 years ago or 50 years ago when this play was written. Ninette, quote, while there is no formal chorus in Death of a Salesman, I believe Happy and Biff act as the choral characters. For one, these characters provide an inside commentary on Willie. We learn inside information about Willie from them that we may not know otherwise. Olivia now disagrees. Quote, Abrams and Harfin describe a choral character as, quote, a single person who spoke the prologue and epilogue to a play, and sometimes introduced each act as well. Since neither Happy nor Biff represents outside introductions to the acts, or even the prologue epilogue, these characters wouldn't be considered choral. But one has to say on behalf of Ninette, Olivia, what about this? The definition you quote pertains to a particular Renaissance evolution of the chorus. What about the more modern development mentioned above, as well as by many of you, whereby the chorus, again, just as I said above, quote, refers to a person within the play itself who stands apart from the action, and by his or her comments provides the audience with a special perspective through which to view the other characters and events. Yet, even by this definition, one wonders about Happy and Biff, Ninette. Sarli, in, quote, an argument with Willie and Happy, Biff says, you're practically full of it. We all are. I'm through with it. As well as later on in the same argument when he says, and I never got anywhere because you, Willie, blew me so full of hot air I could never stand taking orders from anybody. That's whose fault it is. Biff's words indeed provide, quote, inside commentary on Willie. But you can see how this works. It's such a sinuous and difficult concept, this idea of the choral. So far inside is this commentary as to be part of the action itself. This attack, which is really what it is, Biff's attacking Willie, doesn't it help to push Willie over the edge in a way that nothing Charlie says ever does? It's hard to call it commentary. In commentary, we offer remarks on something. We're not a part of that thing that we're commenting on, or we're no longer commentators in those moments. Otherwise, nothing we say would not be commentary, other than maybe imperative commands and reactions to them, right? Descriptive statements about a thing. Offering some of those is not enough to confirm your choral character, if you see what I'm saying, because people are doing that all the time in the character. All the characters are doing that in the play. Note how Linda also appears to be far inside, and too far inside to qualify. As Jocelyn notes, Linda grounds Willie by saying, but you're doing wonderful, dear. You're making $70 to $100 a week. You don't talk too much. You're just lively. Willie, darling, you're the handsomest man in the world. These are just some of Linda's comments to support the fact, Okay, Jocelyn goes on, that she's helping Willie to suppress some of his worry and anguish. But that's exactly something that the traditional chorus could not do. Notice how what Charlie has to say to Willie is just pretty much blown off by Willie, okay? And for the most part, what Charlie has to say comes across as something that emanates from a position outside of the action. Adjacent to it, very close to it, he's on stage, just as the chorus in Antigone is on stage. He's on stage, and he is able to speak to the characters, the other characters in the play who are involved in the action. But it's just part of the convention. I'll talk about conventions down below, okay, in this video. It's part of the convention governing the chorus in tragedy that these choral characters just cannot say anything. It's almost as though they don't have the strength, okay, the sort of ontological substance in the play to be able to really change anything, right? So you see the chorus in Antigone doesn't change anybody's mind and doesn't change the action and shift the action around in any significant way. By the way, along these same lines, note Jocelyn on Bernard. Bernard could be that character she argues who was really not directly involved in the action, but gives us a glimpse into the attitude of Biff and his math efforts. Bernard is ever trying to pin down Biff, that's so well said, to help him study for math before he fails. Bernard states at one point, listen, Biff, I heard Mr. Birnbaum say that if you don't start studying math, he's going to flunk you. You won't graduate. I heard it. Well, we know now that Biff did not study and graduate, and this set off the chain of events that eventually led to the tragedy of Willie taking his life. Bernard is a choral character, okay? Jocelyn concludes, as he stands apart from the action, his comments give us a perspective of a flaw or foreshadowing in Biff's greatness in sports and with the ladies. Well said, very well said, Jocelyn, but consider, if you will, Olivia's point regarding occasional narration, which I thought was a very good point. Almost all characters help to move the story along. They're introduced into the play and they help to move the story along. Bernard's a good example of this by revealing details of past history or present difficulty. Howard Wagner, Willie's boss, is a good example of this. We don't have Howard on the play or in the play having that conversation with Willie. We don't find out certain things about Willie's background, you know, and his how he helped to get the business going. And he worked for Howard's father and all the rest. But is Howard choral? Is he a choral character simply because he tells us a few things and helps to elucidate and reveal a few things about Willie's work history that we would not otherwise know? He provides no, quote, side commentary, as Olivia puts it. Does Bernard do so, is a question that arises, right? It made me think of Howard. Does Bernard do so? For all the glimpses, which was such a nice phrase, all the glimpses he affords into Biff's history and character, does he do so? Right? Does he provide a side commentary, a commentary at all, according to a sharp sense of that word, any more than does Howard? And you can tell I don't think that he does. And I think he's different from Charlie in this way. Now, what about Willie himself? I am glad a few of you gave Willie a go. But I think what Nanette has to say is, in the end, is very difficult to disagree with, right? Abrams and Harfer state that the choral character, and here we get the quote again, stands apart from the action. I hope you commit this to memory. And by his or her comments provides the audience with a special perspective. I'm not sure that I see how Willie provides a special perspective, Nanette argues. And he is definitely not, quote, apart from the action, as he is the action. That's one of the best lines in your entire discussion board, okay? That Willie is the action. So he is just by virtue of his being so involved in everything that happens. He is both the actor and the acted upon throughout the course of the play. He, no more than Crayon, could serve a choral function, despite the fact that now and then he can offer insights, okay? He can offer comments. These are not the kinds of comments that the commentary that would constitute a commentary that a choral would offer, right? A comment is like a moment of reflection, maybe. Yeah, he can have a moment of reflection, but that is not to say that he's developing, okay, this quote-unquote special perspective, or even much of a perspective at all, okay? He's too caught up in his problems to really get outside of them long enough to offer what we would consider to be, okay, a special perspective or a separate perspective on the action. He is the action, is the simplest way to put this. Elijah spiritedly replies that, quote, Willie throughout the play does have several internal dialogues, which can directly allude to his being a choral character, because internal dialogues are specifically for the audience to understand a character better by seeing their thoughts. Again, well said. However, if our criterion for identification is choral is that a character share thoughts, whether by exposing internal dialogues or some other method, then again, even crayon would be choral. Nobody would not be choral, right? No one in a play who thinks at any length would not be a choral character by that definition. Almost all characters in the play, a modern play especially, would be to a degree choral, with these modern plays having so much talk in them, okay, about what's going on. Also, even by the participants. Also, Willie's thinking and ruminating, okay, I think you would agree. This is what it means to say that he's too involved in the action. His thinking and ruminating lead to actions, seem to stem from actions, any number of them, or even all of them, as, for example, again, Charlie's thinking and commenting do not. Now, Jimmy claims that, quote, these characters don't fall into one category so as to offer a singular perspective to be viewed on the sidelines. None of these characters does, according to Jimmy. Jimmy, according to what definition of the chorus, one must ask, must the perspective, the commentary rather, be unitary and unvarying, which seems to be the premise behind your statement. Now, the social body they represent typically doesn't shift around, right? It depends on what you mean by perspective. That the social perspective doesn't shift around in the sense that we define perspective as where they're coming from, who they are, right? Good example would be Sophocles' chorus. It doesn't change from Athenian citizens to the wives of Athenian citizens. It remains consistently those Athenian citizens throughout. But what they say, this folks from that perspective, the perspective, in a slightly different sense of perspective when it's closer to the word commentary, the commentary, the attitudes that they reveal, okay, on what they're looking at, that they reveal from the perspective of Athenian citizens, right, you know, does shift around. They're all over the place, the chorus, you will recall. You know, note how the simple way to think about this is note how the commentary bespeaks, according to Abrams and Harpham, norms, plural, not norm, not one static set of established principles and beliefs. Okay, so Jimmy, I would argue that I know what you're getting at. They seem to be all over the place, and there seems to be this fracturing of perspective that is offered us, even by a guy like Charlie. He doesn't sound necessarily all that consistent. On the other hand, look closely at Charlie. Look at what he has to say. Look at that most significant thing that he has to say, which I bullet pointed down below. Now, this is something that a student in a different section was very interested in. Charlie says during a conversation with Willie Loman, nobody dares to blame this man. You don't understand. Willie was a salesman. See how this connects us up with the title, Death of a Salesman. He was a salesman. Death of a what? Well, of this sort of guy. For a salesman, there's no rock bottom to the life. You don't put a bolt to a knot. You don't tell you the law, give you medicine. He's a man way out there in the blue, riding on a smile and a shoe shine. This quote, the student wrote, encapsulates Charlie's understanding of Willie's struggles and the nature of the salesman's life, expressing empathy for Willie, but also offering insight into the play's broader themes, such as the illusion of the American dream and the crushing weight of societal expectations. And I think that's accurate, and I think that is a thing that Charlie has to say, and which is the kind of center or hub from which most of what he has to say radiates throughout the entire play. So I guess, Jimmy, I disagree where Charlie's concerned, right? I think we do have a singular perspective that he has offered, even though, once again, I don't know that it's a norm. Okay. In fact, I happen to think quite strongly that there is not a definite and static norm that is required of the members of the chorus. Okay, they can be all over the place, and if you look at Antigone's chorus, I think you would agree. They can even contradict themselves, those guys, if you see what I'm saying, in a way that I don't think Charlie ever does. Well, enough on this. Okay, wait a second. Time out. Let's just take a moment here, okay, to make an important point. Of course, to have your chorus or choral character affect the hero's actions at all, is that not to do something innovative? Isn't it a stretch? Isn't it to stretch a rule of the genre? Isn't it to modify a convention? I want to introduce this notion of a literary convention, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit below, right? It's been said that the chorus, which sees Clytemnestra in the play Agamemnon, which is one of the great Greek tragedies, it's been said that the chorus in that play, which sees Clytemnestra, knife in hand, approach Agamemnon as he sits in his bath is not allowed to warn him. Okay, bearing witness to what's about to happen, they're not allowed to rush in and save him. It's just against the rules. Choruses can't do things like that. Okay, they can't be involved. It's not a matter of their simply not being involved. It goes against the convention, the literary, as it were, kind of unspoken agreement and expectation, okay, of authors who write in these particular genres. But think about what happens when we get more modern, right? And you get the feeling that a lot of these old genres, they're not being scrapped. They're being, in various ways, investigated and modified and kind of exploited is maybe the best word for them, right? What do we have, for example, in trifles? I want you to think about this. Imagine that the two women, you remember them, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, a chorus of two. Imagine them as the chorus of that play. That was originally going to be one of your items. Well, for whatever reason. A chorus of two uniting in the end to save a small t tragic heroine, Mrs. Wright, simply, if I think quite devilishly, by resuming choral convention and refusing to intervene in the action. Kind of go back to being a chorus, right? Start out maybe as a chorus, nobody's paying much attention to them. They're offering community commentary. You see the men there in the, on the scene early on as constituting a kind of competitive chorus, a rival chorus made of the men, which I think is a very interesting way of reading the play, right? Maybe with the possible exception of the district commissioner, right, or the DA, as it were, who was actually doing the investigating, right? It seems a little bit too involved, but the other two are just there to kind of offer statements, right? The women seem to be that as well, and you can imagine the play continuing with the two of them kind of falling into the background and showing up now and then to offer comments, to say this, to say that. But in fact, we see them take the stage, take center stage. Mrs. Wright is off stage. Tragedy is off stage, and we have this kind of subsection of tragedy, which features choral characters, if you will, right? Who, in fact, to the extent that there's any action in the play, they're the ones who act, and there's not much action in the play. I mean, all they really do is look in a bag, find something that's dead, and decide to leave it there, right? Even as they comment upon it. Let me reread that sentence. Resuming choral convention, this chorus of two, uniting in the end to resume choral convention and refuse to intervene in the action, which they could have done by presenting the dead bird to the men, even as they comment upon it, okay? Even as they, throughout, and I think even at the very end, are commenting upon the action. They, at the end, could, that's consistent throughout, but at the end they could go back to just a commentary, right? Just the function of commentary is their only function at the very end. And you can see this as a devilish bit of fun. The topic isn't fun, but aesthetically, you can imagine that a glass bell is in fact doing some very interesting things here that are fairly playful in their own way. Okay? So here's a generalization. Modern plays monkey with a convention. It's a pretty simple point, but I think it's a good one, right? And one that's very worth bearing in mind as we try to understand literary history and try to prepare ourselves to be English majors whose careers are going to be investigations of literary history. Modern plays monkey with the conventions. These long established rules of the genre get played with, monkeyed around with by moderns who want to write something like a tragedy, right? But don't feel that the old style, the old form is precisely fits what they're up to. Note how they do not, here's an important distinction, note how these modern plays do not reject or ignore those conventions. Even if they do not venerate and obey them, they don't reject or ignore them. That's not the way to do it. That's not the way to get yourself taken seriously. It would appear when we look at literary history, you don't ignore, reject wholesale, right? You invoke and then transform. That seems to be the way to do it. And again, that speaks to the staying power of genre as much as it does to anything else, which was the whole point of our the last video, right? Was one of the big points of the last video was this remarkable staying power and stability of genre. At the same time, mutability of genre, the mutability and longevity of genre. Stability some sort of essential core is stable, right, of these genres, even as they undergo this mutation. So they're still recognizable as tragedy or the tragic mode. But nobody would say that that's a Greek tragedy when you read Trifles, or you read Chekhov, or you read this play. Just let me note in passing what's down here, and I hope it's legible, which is in accordance with that star up above just after the first sentence. The first sentence was, but of course to have your chorus or choral character affect the hero's actions at all is to do something innovative, right? Well, do note how some critics think that an evidently passive and at best reactive Greek chorus, such as we have in Antigone, is more active and involved than we tend to recognize. You know, in other words, that fundamental premise of the inactivity of the chorus is something that some critics have called into question. Now, I don't feel that they have done so all that compellingly, but it's still a very interesting claim. Hawthorne, for example, notes how many critics have long recognized how the chorus in Greek tragedies may be clearly, quote, clearly and directly involved in the action by doing such things as arguing, supplicating, or deceiving. And Hawthorne goes on to say, look, even when they're silent, they're just standing there, they make a difference. They're in a sense involved in the action. Yeah, but others, you know, they'll retort such things, right? That line, doing such things as arguing, supplicating, or deceiving. Well, these things, aren't they to be distinguished from things like burying, issuing decrees, committing suicide, right? Drawing your sword on your father, as Hymen does, right? I mean, there's certain actions that are really actions. Then there are other actions that are kind of like if you stretch, you know, when the Greek chorus wants to get into a discussion about with Crayon about the lawfulness of what he's doing, okay? And they end up celebrating some of the things that he is, some of his premises and whatnot. Is that really action at the same level as what Hymen is doing when he draws his sword? So, you know, you have an argument about this. You have a debate on this whole question of whether that convention, as we recognize it, is really there, okay? But I think the consensus is that there is a difference between what a choral character is doing on a stage and what a non-choral character who's involved in the action is doing on the stage. For fans of Miss Frances and of Ben, perhaps, as candidates or nominees for the choral character, Barazzato and Catrombone might come to your assistance. They argue that choral groups assume different intra-dramatic, which means within the drama itself, identities according to the specific plots in which they partake. A similar attention to the choral intra-dramatic identity, which just means the identity taken up by the chorus in whatever drama he or she or it happens to be a part of, has provided a strong corrective against those interpreters who make too straightforward identifications between the tragic chorus and the civic collectivity, which is something we've been doing, right? That's what I was talking about before when I said I don't know about Miss Frances or I don't know about Ben, because what do they represent? Aren't they a bit elliptical and eccentric and a bit out there, as I said, a bit far out, right? Spatially, economically, socially. Arguing against such politicizing views of the tragic chorus, the famous Gold in 1996 convincingly maintains that tragic choruses quite often embody social groups that were perceived as marginal within Athenian 5th century society. So if you go back again, go back to the original convention as it was established by the Greeks, and you might find that there are, that there's a kind of a range of possibility with respect to the relationship between the chorus and the community surrounding the action of the play, right? Now, in Antigone, there's no doubt about it. They are like elders. They're referred to as old men, you will recall. They're like the city fathers. They're like the guys at the barbershop, but probably if one of the guys at the barbershop is also mayor of the town, right? That's who they are in Antigone, and that's who they are in lots of Greek tragedies, okay? But every now and then, as Gold argues, you get them representing something that's a little bit off, a little bit eccentric, a little bit out there, right? The chorus. And it's interesting. There isn't a one-to-one match between the chorus necessarily, even when you go back to the Greeks, in every tragedy between the chorus and the surrounding fairly conventional minded, okay, community. And I think that's really interesting to keep that open as a possibility here of, for example, Miss Frances, whom you see here in a certain production of the play, being kind of romanced by Willie, and how would that scornful laugh, as some of you said, might itself constitute a choral comment. Where we've been heading this whole time is towards a concept, or a notion at least, of the literary convention and the power of conventions. I think this is no surprise to you if you're still with me. To quote the Abrams and Harfum glossary, they have a wonderful, wonderfully helpful entry on this question. Quote, conventions are conspicuous features of subject matter, form, or technique that occur repeatedly in works of literature. Conventions, in a sense, may be recurrent types of character, choral character, turns of plot, reversal, reveal tragedy, forms of versification, the sonnet, or kinds of diction and style, iambic pentameter in poetry. Stock characters such as the Elizabethan braggart soldier, or the languishing and fainting heroine of Victorian fiction, or the sad young men of the lost generation novels of the 1920s, were among the conventions of their literary eras. And it's interesting how that Elizabethan braggart soldier is still around. I mean, look at, I don't know about Band of Brothers, but look at, for example, Saving Private Ryan, and the character played by Edward, I almost said Norton, what's his last name? You know the guy I'm talking about. He plays the guy with the big gun who complains a lot. And he might not be the best example of the braggart, but I think I don't know, Saving Private Ryan, maybe it's the character is the sniper, right? But you have these conventional figures who are still with us, right? Who were introduced a long time ago. To continue, the abrupt reform of the villain at the end of the last act was a common convention of melodrama. Euphuism, which is high and flowery language in prose, and the Petrarchan and metaphysical conceits in verse were conventional devices of style. It is now just as much a matter of literary convention to be outspoken on sexual matters as it was to be reticent in the age of Charles Dickens and George Eliot. So these conventions do change. It's over time, as we've seen, there's a kind of mutability of literary genre and a mutability of literary convention as well. But I think what's would have been a better note to end on here, it seems to me, would have been how stable they are over time, even though, of course, there are all kinds of innovations upon them and changes and mutations. It's remarkable how you can still find them from very earlier works. They don't just get scrapped every generation and we form a whole new set of them. It's not the way it works. Yeah, a final word on conventions. You associate the word convention probably with the adjective conventional, which is not necessarily a term of approbation. When I think of very conventional people I know, I tend to think of them as fairly shallow people. They just observe the rules, and they do what they've been told to do, and they do what they've been taught to do, and they don't innovate, and they don't invent, okay? Here's what Harfum and Abrams have to say on that topic. Quote, invention was originally a term used in theories of rhetoric and later in literary criticism to signify the finding of the subject matter by an orator or a poet. It then came to signify innovative elements in a work in contrast to the deliberate imitation of the forms and subjects of prior literary models. And you can see how that would work to the extent that you're imitative of forms and subjects of prior rather literary models, you're being very conventional. At the present time, invention is often opposed to convention in sense 2 above, which is the sense that was quoted in the previous plate, to signify the inauguration by a writer of an unprecedented subject or theme or form or style, and the resulting work is said to possess originality. Who would not want to be thought an original, right? So does that mean you need to be very inventive, give yourself over to invention, and try to be as unconventional as possible. Try not to observe conventions. Try to reject all the conventions, right? Is that the way it works? Repeatedly in the history of literature, innovative writers such as John Donne, Walt Whitman, James Joyce, or Virginia Woolf rebel against reigning conventions of their time to produce highly original works, only to have their inventions imitated by other writers, who thereby convert literary novelties into an additional set of literary conventions. And I think we've already seen some evidence of this when we're talking about genre, right? Where what looked to be this kind of mutation that was taking us pretty far outside of the province of recognizable tragedy ends up becoming this thing called, by way of its approach to comedy, this thing called tragicomedy, and has its own set of literary conventions that grow up in its own, what seemed to be a brand new and distinct field, that had nothing to do and scorned the whole notion of a convention, the whole notion of a genre, suddenly becomes a genre in its own right with its own set of conventions. Okay, and you even look at Joyce and Woolf and Whitman and Donne, and I think what you'll see is, yes, there's radical innovation, but at the same time, once again, their innovations are such that you can see the conventions that they're transforming and transmogrifying. Okay, you can see them. You can see the conventions there. It's not as though it's just written in a vacuum, as though there's been no history whatsoever. And here Harfam and Abrams go on to say something similar to what I just said. There's nothing either good or bad in the extent or obviousness of conformity to pre-existing conventions. All depends on the effectiveness of the use an individual writer makes of them. The pastoral elegy, for example, is one of the most conspicuously convention-bound of literary forms. Yet in Lycidas, John Milton achieved what, by wide critical agreement, ranks as one of the greatest lyrics in the language. He did this by employing the ancient pastoral rituals, but not just imitating them. He imitated them, and he transformed them and employed them with freshness, a kind of newness and novelty and power, so as to absorb an individual's death into the universal human experience and to add to his voice the resonance of earlier pastoral laments for a poet who died young. So he very much wanted his voice to be heard as a kind of echo, okay, for all its own pitch, its own novel, unique pitch and tone and timbre. He didn't want you to forget about the voices that went before, that were heard before in the tradition. He wanted to line up his voice as the latest instance of that kind of expression of voice, that kind of pitch and timbre in tenor, okay? And so, once again, I think it shows the extent to which literary innovation, literary innovation and tradition kind of split the difference between them, right? And you rarely see a literary innovation that really takes hold of us and becomes powerful, okay, and becomes compelling, right? Except by way of its own, well, by way, number one, of the fact that it's, or the degree to which it itself gets imitated, therefore showing the power of imitation, the power of convention, or by showing that, or rather, you see it in its power by the degree to which, in fact, it participates in this kind of tradition and does not forget previous literary conventions, okay, even as it innovates upon them. But in fact, the emphasis becomes or falls on that, upon them, right, upon the foundations that exist already. That's the way literary history tends to work. Now, this video has been going on long enough, so I'm going to let you go at this point. Just to mention that Trofimov, okay, who a picture of whom Ethan Hawke. You thought it was Ethan Hawke. No, that was Trofimov in the last plate. Okay. Those of you who responded to the Trofimov prompt will have a separate, not a video, but a separate little item devoted to what the good work that you did. Okay, so farewell for now.